Okay.
I was looking at his album, the shirt, the pink. I'm ready to get down with it.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I think we're just about ready to start our final panel, um, which I will try to say again. We're just ready to start our final panel, and it's. Yeah, you guys might know. See, this is people who know how to do shit. All right. Okay, so our final panel, sort of provocatively, is called What is to be Done? And, you know, obviously, this is a reference to the very famous text by Lenin, who himself was, riffing on a 19th century Russian revolutionary novelist, Nikolai Chernevsky. And which has been like rewritten like a bajillion times. I bought just one example of this, like that's extremely sort of weird and obscure, but this is Dr. Ali Shariati's What is to be Done, which is an Islamic Marxist vanguardist text, on behalf of a certain kind of like intellectual worker to what he calls, pardon my sort of scholastic Persian, mustazifan, these like basically what Fanon's wretched of the earth, right? And I do think there's a little bit of like the specter of vanguardism haunts always this question when it is sort of a gathering of people to say, well, what the fuck should we do? And actually, that's one of the funniest things about that phrase. One of my favorite contemporary critical theorists, Susan Buck-Morss, says that what is to be done is actually a mistranslation of a much simpler phrase, which is literally just what to do. And that's what this panel is about. As with last night, my role here is moderator. I'll introduce everyone in a moment. But the goal for this panel, this is literally what I emailed you guys, is pretty well summed up in its title. On this panel are organizers, policy specialists, academics, and activists. And while most of this weekend's panels have been primarily analytic, I mean, there's been practical discussion as well, but primarily analysis, description, right? Looking at questions of economics, identity, ecology, technology, and art, and more. This panel, even if only an opening attempt, is in part prescriptive. Right? Talking about concrete things from action to policy to politics and beyond that people might do. And I also want, this is meant to be sort of plenary, right? So I want you all, we always do Q&A, right, at the end of everything. That's pretty conference standard. But like, do take a moment, like if you have a notebook, like think about questions that you want to ask and you want answered or that you're thinking about in terms of practice, in terms of what you think needs to be done. So, without any more from me, I think this is like vaguely in order. I'll try my best. To my left, and again, I'll make my joke that that's not a political designation, is Maria Svart. Maria Svart is the National Director of the Democratic Socialists of America. She studied social movement history and gender studies at U Chicago before becoming a campus environmental organizer, being busted while trying to form a union, and then spending almost a decade in the labor movement before moving to DSA in 2011. On my right is my colleague, Raphaële Chappe, and sometimes co-author. She holds Raphaële Chappe is a core faculty member of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. She holds a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research and a law degree from New York NYU's School of Law. You don't want me to list all your stuff. She writes about everything. Yeah. Do you want anything? Especially inequality, economics, political economy, and law. Like, those are her specializations. To my immediate left, as my notes will allow me, is Erica Smiley. I will not read the whole thing, but Erica Smiley oversees the organizing department at Jobs with Justice, which includes local and national campaign work, and a team dedicated to developing innovative strategies to expand collective bargaining power. She has written, I used this line before, but for basically everywhere, a ton of places, and she is organized basically everywhere. Like, seriously, that is a lot of places. And then finally, all the way on my left is Marshall Steinbaum. Marshall Steinbaum is the research director and fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, where he researches market power and inequality. He works on antitrust, competition policy, the labor market, higher ed, and student debt. He is the co-editor of After Piketty, which is actually on my bookshelf to read right now, and has written for also kind of like everywhere. So please welcome our panelists, so welcome. And I'm going to ask Maria to go first if she doesn't mind.
So the task we have before us is to transform society. That's not a small task. And in order to do that, we have to build working class power. So the question becomes, how do we do that? It comes down to a couple of basic questions. The first is, how do we learn what people are willing to fight for? We can't make assumptions about that. And how do we learn who they are willing to follow when they're afraid? And I think those are the core questions that as an organizer, I want to ask myself. So I think there are 5 key things that'll probably take less than 5 minutes that are big concepts that I want to bring up and hope we can talk about. The first is in the era of Facebook and celebrity, we have to scale up our messaging. We have to do it while we can, and this is partly because we don't own Facebook. We know the state is surveilling us more and more. We also know that we have to transform society for all of the reasons we talked about in the climate panel. We have to really scale up our messaging to a mass scale, and it has to be created by and resonate with the diversity of the working class in this country and across the globe. We can't afford to leave anyone behind. And I think the study that was referenced earlier out of Minnesota about having a class plus race narrative being really critical, I absolutely agree with that. And I also think we need to realize that we have to have as much poetry as prose. And a little too often the left has a lot of prose. So that's number 1. Number 2, we have to create mechanisms for people to learn, and we have to make mechanisms for masses of people to learn. And we also have to learn ourselves. So we have to learn to listen, another thing the left is not great at, but which organizers have to do out of necessity. We have to reach beyond the choir and listen. In DSA, we do this by canvassing. We're doing canvassing on a million different issues in all 50 states, and because we have chapters in all 50 states. Canvassing isn't the only way to reach people, but it is a really clear and effective way to get beyond the choir that is the left. And then we have to debrief what we're hearing and apply those lessons. We have to debrief collectively because that's how we all learn and we democratize information. And we have to apply the lessons because we have to evolve and grow. The third thing that I'd like to mention is think about teaching history and teaching ideas. And that is the social reproduction for our movements that is really, really necessary to do. That means teaching people to question and think critically and setting space up for debates and for people to apply the things that they've learned when they're talking to people outside the choir. It means learning about past experiments like we talked about last night. And it really means being willing to be changed. Number 4, we have to join the struggles because otherwise what's the point? And I think that's the most important lesson is it's not enough to talk about and try to understand the world. That's partly because we, as the left, don't have the trust of working people and the poor. We have to build that. We have to build credibility. We have to build that by being in the trenches with folks. And that's also how we build trust across difference. And coming out of the labor movement, I feel incredibly strongly that the best way to build trust and build a stronger movement across difference is by being together in struggle. And struggle is the only way we're going to build power. So in DSA, there are 3 main national priorities that we democratically chose at our last convention, which had almost, I want to say, 700 delegates. I can't remember at this point. One arena is in workplaces. This is where people most quickly realize who their enemy is, and they most quickly realize that they have common interests across their differences. And it's also the place where we can disrupt the economy, particularly in strategic sectors of the economy, but for the reason I mentioned about people quickly understanding who their common enemy is, all workplaces are sites of resistance. Second is in the political realm, the formal political realm, and some people say that it's the place that we should engage because that's where most people do politics in this country, but I actually think that that's becoming less the case. As people mentioned, almost barely 50% of people vote, and I think that's something we have to take seriously. The reason I think that we need to be involved in politics is because the results matter. Who has power, who controls the state matters. And what's critical is that we don't lie to people about what it means to be politically engaged, right? What happened with Obama is a whole generation of people became inspired and then hit the wall, right? And that demobilizes people. So we have to be really honest about what we're doing when we engage in politics. And in DSA, our political strategy is to build independent political power. And the way we do that is we train our chapters to power map their community and assess what the balance of forces is, assess how the parties function in their state and in their community, because it really is different everywhere. We don't apply a cookie cutter approach, but you assess the situation, and then we train them to run their own canvases, run their own campaign, run their own messaging, negotiate with candidates about what we'll bring to the table, and retain some control over that. So we come out the other side with better capacity, a more organized membership, a list, and more credibility and visibility. So it really is about building our own power, but not doing it in a dogmatic way or a knee-jerk way, but really doing it thoughtfully and strategically. And then finally, generally organizing in communities for transformative reforms and otherwise reforms that take power from the capitalist class, that empower the working class, where people begin to feel their agency and understand that collective action is how we're going to win. In DSA, the campaign that we're working on is Medicare for All. It's something that has a clear enemy, the insurance industry. It can engage with people that aren't even in the formal workplace in a lot of ways. It would decommodify a huge sector of the economy, and it is deeply and widely felt. So when we're out on doors talking to folks, and even when we go out and talk about political candidates, if you lead with the candidate and then you bring up the issue, people are like, yeah, that's nice. If you lead with the issue, people become deeply involved. You find out what their self-interest is in changing the system, and then you can bring up the candidate, and they're much more inspired about the candidate. And the way we do our organizing around Medicare for All, we actually organize around a set of values and principles. We will mention the specific legislation because there are several options out there. There's true Medicare for All, and then there's a number of other market-based solutions. And we really want folks to understand what Medicare for All means and what it does not. So getting out into communities is really central. And then the fifth, of course, I'm with DSA, so I will reiterate why we're building DSA, because we need to build institutions to organize folks. We need institutions that open as many doors as possible to the movement so people can join, and trains as many people as possible and moves them into motion and community. So we have regional leadership trainings that we do across the country to teach folks about how to do all of this kind of activity. And we do the political education and facilitating debate. So, having a really holistic approach is really critical for the left, and trying to bridge the divide between the academic left and the rest of the 99% is incredibly critical. And I hope we can talk about some of these concepts more.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Up next, Raphaële, do you want to?
Sure. Thank you. So what I thought I'd do is take an opportunity to debrief a bit also about what's been said. last night and today. So Kali Okuna was asking, how do we actually transform the world, right? And in order to do that, we have to think about the world that's actually in front of us. And I think he said, we're living today in 2018, not in 1991. And so I want to take a step back and just think about where we actually are. So Marx predicted that capitalism would collapse, but that hasn't happened, right? So what has kept capitalism alive? Have we reached a breaking point? So, in the 50s and 60s, right after the debacles of 2 world wars, the Depression, capitalism picked up again. There was seemingly an engine of growth, reduction in wealth and income inequalities. Though now that we've read Piketty, we know that that was just an exceptional moment, right, due to special circumstances to make up the losses that were sustained during the war and to basically go back to the technological frontier. So capitalism was kept alive by convergence economics, demographic growth, but this has come to an end, at least for the richer countries, and will indeed be for the world as a whole after the BRICS catch up. So what we have in the 70s is growth starts to slow down. We get the Thatcher-Reagan revolutions, the neoliberal turn, and capitalism seemingly reverts back to the form it had in the late 19th century, which is a world characterized by slow growth. Now, the crash of 2008 was only the latest in a long sequence of political and economic disorders in response to a crisis that began in the 70s. So the question here is, how was capitalism kept alive during that period? Something that Marx couldn't fully appreciate because, of course, he didn't have the full historical perspective. He didn't see this ability that capitalism has to morph and evolve and find new strategies and new energy to sustain itself. So what we saw in the 70s is financialization, enabled by a context of deregulation for capital flows. Kali Okuno made the point, I think that's really interesting, we don't have a full grasp on finance. And Anwar Sheikh reminded us that financial profits in Marx aren't about extraction of surplus value per se, but just about buying cheap and selling dear. So the question, what is financialization? What is it about? Well, its finance emerges as a locus of profit, right, instead of industry and production, and increasingly a share of corporate profits is derived from financial investments made in financial assets rather than productive assets. Okay. So think here, GE makes more money from financing car purchases than actually from car production itself. You also get a US squeeze on wages, right? So the wage in the 70s starts to become stagnant. Productivity is increasing, but not real wages. And the ability here to impose that project in the US happened through a kind of artificial stimulation of the maintenance of standard of living. So even though the wages are low, we can buy cheap imports. The US starts to run twin deficits, trade deficits. So it's importing more than it's exporting, and it's using the dollars that the US can print. And these dollars are recycled into the US economy because there's a demand for US assets. So in short, you get rising public debt in the US, but the public debt isn't necessarily of concern, unlike the Greek debt, as long as China wants to keep selling stuff to the US and wants to reinvest it in US assets. So capitalism morphs into a creature that the Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis calls the global minotaur. I like the expression because foreign capital keeps being fed to the US economy as some sort of a foreign tribute. In this model, there's heavy reliance on the attractiveness of the US dollar as a world reserve currency. But rising public debt isn't sufficient to keep delivering high standards of living to the US population. So the third moment of this neoliberal sequence is a rise in private debt. People keep borrowing to maintain the standard of living. And this, of course, is made possible by the very squeeze on wages. People have to borrow to maintain the quality on life. So that takes us to the 2008 crisis. And what's interesting here is that the survival of capitalism was shown to depend on master technicians, namely the central banks, right, that provided the system with unlimited liquidity, creating reserves, injecting those reserves in the economy to the tune of a $3 trillion increase in the balance sheet of the Fed. Doing what? Saving the banks, right? The banks are key to the functioning of the economy. Schmidt was mentioned earlier, and this was a very Schmittian moment where the normal rules were suspended. And there was very little democratic control of the process. So the response to the crisis was quantitative easing. What's next? Even Larry Summers has given up the hope that close to zero interest rates can produce significant economic growth in the foreseeable future. So can we anticipate the next move of capitalism, right? Kali Akuno also asked, what are the forces of production today, right? He raised the possibility of a transition to a new regime of accumulation driven by AI. And he asked this important question of social control, and could this be the next phase of capital accumulation in terms of value extraction, but also in terms of political repression? Michelle Miller's inspiring answer to this is to remind us of the potential for AI to do great things for us, right? We need to think about how to not make it about resource extraction, but how to assert our own ownership of the data that we produce, both at an individual level and at a collective level. And this brings us to the issue of monopolies, which is a real challenge because this data is controlled by these behemoth digital platforms, right? The Facebook and Googles and Amazon, etc. So the question here for economists is potentially increasing returns to scale. It's a new world, right? With network effects, this is not the world that economists have been describing. Yeah? Final issue to think about is how we collaborate. I thought it was interesting, Drusilla Cornell's anecdote about Obama, that she said that he at least understood that he was ruling on behalf of people, but then she added that of course he didn't. So there's this issue of power and the illusion of electoral democracies, right, falling apart. If we're going to transition to something else, we have to understand the structures of power and how to disrupt those structures, because even with the best intentions, if certain incentive structures are in place and power structures are in place, then you don't get to the results that you want because you're trapped in a kind of a prisoner's dilemma, right, where the short-term incentives prevent us from reaching the goals that are socially optimum and desirable. So there's an invitation there also to rethink our views of productivity and business models that aren't driven by productivity. Ajay, you said something really interesting, that capitalism can't account for its own costs. So what we think of as productive isn't actually productive, right? So things like GDP aren't properly measured. We need economists to step up to the task and incorporate the true social costs and environmental costs so that everyone can see where the problem lies. And we need everyone to be convinced of this issue that this financial version of capitalism that we have is actually destroying us all. I think I want to end on this note, on this optimist, on this sunny note.
Thanks, Erica.
Thank you. All right. What to do? I did not know every time I said that I was invoking Lenin. I'm very, that's fantastic. My name is Erica Smiley. Most of my friends call me Smiley. And I should just start with a quick disclaimer, because in my tradition, I am both Southern and, a long-time member of the CPUSA, which dictates that I speak very long, like a long time, and I will do my best to curtail that, my long-windedness, just for this program, at least so we can hear a little bit about what Marshall has to say. I'm with Jobs with Justice, which is a national network of permanent community labor coalitions with the mission of expanding collective bargaining and collective bargaining power, both the theory of what it is, who gets to negotiate with who, as well as the actual practice of it. And I'm going to focus most of my talk on that specifically, not because I don't think that political power is also key, but I think that the fight for economic power and economic democracy gets separated from the fight for democracy and a healthy democracy in general, and then that comes back and bites us in the ass. And so we really have a mission to demonstrate how the fight for economic power and collective bargaining power is critical and central to a healthy democracy. And it's interesting because when you look at it this way, when you look at expanded collective bargaining power, like the framework we have now is very much anchored in the situation that workers were able to create in the early 1900s, right? So, which culminated after much struggle, which culminated in the New Deal, and so there's kind of a 20th century framework for collective bargaining, which by today's terms, and frankly even by then's, is quite narrow. And but when you look at the map of the country, a lot of organizers, they like to break up the map and what's the blue state and the red state and the purple state. I actually think it's the wrong map. And when you look at the map in relationship to not who elects Democrats and Republicans, but what relationship do people in a given area have to 20th century power, that creates a much different landscape. And in that context, what's happening in the South and the teacher strikes in Kentucky and West Virginia and Arizona and Oklahoma aren't actually that surprising, because those who are in places that have not had 20th century political or economic power, if they ever had it, are much hungrier to find new creative and militant ways to build a 21st century movement, 21st century protections to surround the power building that they're currently modeling. So I say that, and I'm also very proud this week, I should say. Jobs with Justice was recently named by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as an organization that should be counted as a union. I feel like I'll be framing that on my wall, even though we don't organize individual workers or collectively bargain in any way. We have been considered a union by the Chamber of Commerce. And for those without a real class analysis, that can be shocking. Like, why would the Chamber want more unions? But of course they want it because being defined as a union under the 20th century framework is very limiting. It's very you're very regulated, you're very restricted in what you can and can't do, and like all the other tax classifications, C3, C4, whatever, you are very much tracked and regulated into your ability to organize mass movement and mass organization. And so again, looking at this in the context of this current moment, this shouldn't be a surprise for those who have a class analysis and understand the relationship between the 20th century power that we currently somewhat have, or at least the 20th century framework of collective bargaining and politics in the country, which is anchored in commerce and keeping commerce moving, and anchored in this idea of labor peace, as opposed to what I would argue should be a 21st century approach to building power for working people, which should be anchored more in the Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, the freedom of assembly, the freedom against to not be forced into indentured servitude of any kind. Right? These are the protections that should actually anchor a powerful labor movement. And so when you have a labor movement, regulations and laws that are actually anchored in commerce, then of course the interests of capital will prevail, as we are seeing now. All the compromises and all the holes and the gaps in and the 20th century framework that's supposed to protect working people are now getting exposed and exploded. And then thus you have in May of 2018, the US Chamber saying that Jobs with Justice, among other community organizations and worker centers, should be counted as a union. I will be framing that. I'm very excited. So, again, the question for a lot of what I like to say really is whose interests are ultimately protected in the end, because this is a question that we have to really tackle in making day-to-day decisions about campaigns. A thing that I like to say often to our affiliates and to our organizers is, it's sure the arc of justice is long. It may take a very long time for us to win stuff, but what we do right now really matters and will really dictate what our victories mean and look like in the future. And so asking this question is really critical. And maybe this is my Southern tradition, but I don't like to actually start saying what is to be done or what should be done without at least qualifying a little bit of who I am trying to tell you what is to be done. So I'll just start with that. I'm originally from North Carolina, from Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm a Southerner. And my first action was with my church, St. James Presbyterian, and we were out boycotting Kmart because they were, from what I understood, from what my teenage mind got, they were discriminating against black workers. That's what I understood. I didn't know that it was a fight with Act Two. I didn't get that it was a union campaign, right? I just knew that they were being discriminated against and that we, all the black people of Greensboro, were not going to be at Kmart until they got what they wanted. And they did win, right? And I could very much see, again, as a teenager, that collective action and militancy actually got the goods, right? That was a very key lesson. But I say this because I've questioned, over the last 30 years, how do I get to be, anyone in the labor movement saying what is to be done, what to do in the labor movement? I don't come from a union family. I come from North Carolina, which had 2% density even when I was there, right? What is it that qualifies me? But here's the kicker. You realize that you don't build a movement for democracy. You don't build a movement for collective bargaining power amongst people who already have it. You build movement amongst people who don't have it and want it. It's just a very simple fact, right? Like if my ancestors had somehow waited for the Voting Rights Act to pass before they started trying to show up at the polls, right? I'd still be working on some cotton field today. I mean, it would be a complete disaster. And so it's really important for us to know, and it's important for me to know in terms of my role here and the role of Jobs with Justice, is that we're trying to build a movement of this 90% plus, but we'll be liberal. Let's say 90% plus, but really only 6.7% of the country is a member of a union, right, in the private sector. So it's really higher than that. But okay, we'll totally be flexible. 90% plus of the population has no relationship, no membership to a union or even a worker center or some other organization that organizes working people. If we're going to reach them and get them excited about the idea that in order to live and be active in a healthy democracy, they should have governing power in their communities and at their work sites and in all frameworks through where their capital is having some impact on their lives, that's the kind of movement that could actually change the paradigm of our country. That's the kind of movement that could challenge and actually make the right demands when there's a crisis in capital. That's the kind of movement that when there's a bailout of the auto companies, that's the kind of movement that will then say, well, how much do we own then? Do we get a seat on the board? Those are the kind of the demands. Those are the types of subtle things that happen when you build a movement of people who don't necessarily have economic power but want it. So I wanted to give a couple of examples. I have a whole bunch of stuff written here. I wasn't quite sure how to prepare for this, to be honest. I have like a complete, no, it's okay. I totally destroyed the New Deal. It's beautiful. One day we can talk about it. I'll write a blog. I don't know. But I just want to go into some examples of what is being done and talk through some of the things that we could potentially do in the future together. So when I say Jobs with Justice looks at collective bargaining power and seeks to expand the framework of it as well as the practice of it, the number of people doing it, who's bargaining with who over what. That's ultimately what I mean, right? So I'm not just talking about at the work site, although that's, if you can still get a traditional first contract after a fight at a work site, I mean, look, do you, boo? You are really working it right now. You're anyway, good for you. So, but there are other means, and there are other things that people are testing. One is what I like to put in the category of expanded traditional bargaining, and these people use frameworks like bargaining for the common good and things like that. It's really like a 21st century version of social justice unionism. And these are where, at the bargaining table, like Maria was saying earlier, that the work site is in fact seen as a site of struggle, as a site of resistance, not just for the issues at that work site, but also for the issues of a broader community. And this can happen in the public sector, and in fact, most of the popular examples are amongst, say, teachers or nurses who are negotiating also for some of the issues and rights that parents and students and patients care about, and incorporating those demands in their bargaining, and as well as trying to fight for them politically or legislatively. This is also true in the private sector. I mean, historically, the United Auto Workers, they fought Mitt Romney's dad in Michigan, trying to not just negotiate over wages, but over the cost of cars, right, for the community to be able to afford what they were making. So this is often what we like to call expanded traditional bargaining. The next one is what I would put in the category of negotiating with the ultimate benefactor or the ultimate profiteer, or bargaining with, as Stephen Lerner says, bargaining with the 0.01 of the 1%. And this is really important because a lot of times in this moment of our global capitalism, the person who is actually calling the shots is not always as clear. It's not always the boss or the store manager on the factory floor. It's often a financier or some hedge fund manager or whatever. And what we have found is that when we define the bargaining unit to go beyond just that specific site, but to actually look at the ultimate benefactor and define bargaining units around that person, around that guy, and it's almost always a guy, then we actually are able to leverage a different form of power. One example, Greg Penner. Who knows who Greg Penner is? No. Okay, one person. That is a problem. You should know who Greg Penner. Greg Penner is the son-in-law of Rob Walton, and he's the CEO and chair of the board of Walmart. And Greg Penner has a whole bunch of, I won't call them skeletons in his closet because they're actually pretty public. You can go to littlesis.org and look at them, right? So, like, he owns a whole charter school growth fund, and he's on the board of the Hyatt, and he's, of course, chair of the board of Walmart. Like, imagine if you actually combined workers at each of those into bargaining units to then negotiate with Penner. They're Penner's workers. They aren't just Walmart workers or Hyatt workers or charter school workers. They're actually Penner's workers. They're negotiating with Penner over things. Well, it sounds broad and it sounds crazy, but of course the craziest ideas often work the best. And it was actually like 11 guest workers in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, back in 2011, 2012, who were getting their asses kicked, who were fainting on the job and not allowed to go to the bathroom and not allowed to go to bed. And instead of going after their small town boss, this owner of CJ Seafood, they instead decided to go after the biggest buyer, which in fact was Sam Club, which of course was run by Greg Penner. And so from day one, after they marched on their local boss, they started targeting, they treated themselves as a bargaining unit for Walmart and Greg Penner. And wouldn't you know, before, even though retail clerks have been organizing and big unions have been putting a lot of money into Walmart and all this kind of stuff, 11 loosely protected, AKA not really protected at all, guest workers from southern Mexico got a meeting with Walmart over conditions with CJ's. So when we actually look at the class forces in play and organize our bargaining units based on those, we actually can win. The last one, and then I'll wrap here, is what we like to call community-driven strategies. And this is when working people are organized not just as workers at one given work site, but as community members, or as any group of people that is impacted by some force of capital. So perhaps they are tenants, perhaps they are homeowners or underwater homeowners, perhaps they are debtors or student debtors or something like that, right? But that they organize and that they themselves are then able to form a bargaining unit and collectively negotiate with capital in that framework. And right here in New York, you've got one of my favorite examples to tout, which is the Crown Heights Tenants Union, right? So on the one hand, you've got, some of the largest, most powerful real estate moguls in the world here, right? And some of these huge building owners and thousands of people who live and work in these buildings. On the one hand, you've got SEIU 32BJ organizing the building staff in many of these places. And on the other hand, you've got the Crown Heights Tenants Union actually organizing tenants in units to negotiate with capital, with the same forces. Now, what the union organizes, what they form as a collective bargaining agreement will be great. It'll be more of a traditional collective bargaining agreement under the current 20th century labor framework. What the Crown Heights Tenants Union negotiates will also be an enforceable agreement. Well, I would consider that also a collective bargaining agreement, but not under the 20th century framework, something much different that allows working people as whole people to negotiate against capital in smart ways. So I'll end with this, and I end with this not because it's the least of the priorities, but in fact because it's the most important. And that's with the understanding of the role of white supremacy and confronting white supremacy as a way to expand economic power and economic democracy, not because it's the right thing to do, but because not doing so will undeniably guarantee our failure. And I appreciate some of what Maria was saying earlier about approaching Marxism. The best solutions to Marxism in this day and age are non-dogmatic, are more flexible, and actually have a very clear sense of the hegemony with which we are currently living under. Has a very clear sense of how white supremacy hurts white people just as much as it hurts people of color, but in very, very different ways, and of the ultimate bargain that is whiteness that separates working class white people from people of color. And the best thing is that when unions and community organizations and other campaigns do this, they win. And they win big. It's not just that it's the cool, moral, charitable thing to do, but that they actually win. And historically, this is what happened when we looked at the auto workers and their organization at Ford after much pressure from black workers to actually organize in a way that centered equal demands amongst black workers and white workers, as well as with Canton Mills or Tenneco and modern examples in the southern region, or Smithfield, where workers came together in a way that was equally confronting white supremacy just as much as it was trying to win a first contract. So I'll wrap up there because I think there's probably a lot of questions and discussion we can have after this, but like I said, lots more to say about the New Deal. No, I won't do that. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome. All right, and last but not least, Marshall, do you need a...
Today I want to speak on the matter of opening up the black box of capitalism and looking at the complicated wiring of exploitation inside and getting our hands dirty rewiring it. Growing up, as we all have, living through the last decades of labor's immiseration and rising barriers to obtaining life's necessities, onerous burdens, control and surveillance on people who want to live decently and independently, has encouraged many of us to figure out a way around capitalism by decommodifying health, education, housing, and even labor, and that is all necessary. But in that context, figuring out how to change the way capitalism works, rather than figuring out a way around it, smacks of incrementalism. Today I want to try to convince you that rewiring capitalism is not just also radical, it is also necessary. I'm going to start with tax policy. We once had a top marginal income tax rate of 91% in this country. That's a de facto maximum income. In that context, there's no point in outsourcing, offshoring, evicting, or consolidating. Recently, Corbyn has resurfaced the idea of a maximum wage, but let me say that the plutocracy does not make their money by working, but rather by owning. Therefore, we need to go after the income from owning and of ownership itself. And the best way to do that is to deploy the power of the state on behalf of economic liberation, using progressive taxation to make it illegal to be rich. Second, on antitrust policy, long derided as either the preserve of corporate lawyers and their economic consultants, or as a throwback to rural populism with little relevance to the 20th century, working class, let alone the 21st century, I now realize that it played an enormous role in bringing about the deconcentration of corporate power, And that happened not because big business was broken up or busted, but because the set of predatory business models at their disposal was severely curtailed, and they were forced to operate and profit insofar as they were allowed to profit, not by sucking wealth out of workers, consumers, suppliers, and of the business itself, but by investing in those stakeholders. More recently, as right-wing and even some ostensibly left courts eviscerated our antitrust policy, and its enforcement was entrusted to white-shoe lawyers on leave from corner offices, weakening standards have allowed companies to outsource their workforce while still retaining control over it. That is very much a labor problem, but it is also an antitrust problem. Earlier, Michelle Miller raised the possibility that employers would be able to surveil their workers and discern who was likely to be looking for another job and who would find one, and then wage discriminate on that basis. And given how race and gender work in the labor market, this will exacerbate longstanding disparities. To Michelle's nightmare scenario, I would add two things. First of all, this is already happening. And second of all, it is the direct result of weakened antitrust policy, both in making that data available to employers and in giving them the power to use it. The housing and healthcare cost crises are also antitrust problems. We need the countervailing power of the state to protect our interests, but the healthcare establishment and the developers and REITs well know how to profit at public expense. If we want to make those public and universal options work for us, we need antitrust as well. I could go on to communications and financial regulation, corporate governance. All of these are necessary tools like taxes and antitrust. The point is, even if these policies require making state agencies like the Justice Department, the IRS, the FTC, the SEC are battlegrounds, not to mention the federal courts, they are just as subversive, in fact more threatening to establish power thanks to the force of law, than a protest in the street or even at the site of production. The left has to learn to fight and win in the walls of these agencies. We created them, after all, but we lost when their initial purpose, to challenge, subvert, and overthrow concentrated private power with the countervailing power of the state, was forgotten, and their policymaking was removed to technocratic grounds where the ideology came to favor private power. Remaking those spaces into places where power is contested is not incrementalist, and you'll know that when you see how hard and ruthlessly they'll fight back.
I think I'm only going to ask sort of like one threaded question to the panel, and then I'm going to turn it over because, as I said at the beginning, like we want this to be, you know, as involved a sort of plenary session as we can. And the question I want to pose, it's sort of classic, but actually in many ways like starting with Maria and ending with Marshall, right? There is a really interesting, there is a tension. Right, there is a tension, and I feel like you're going to get as much time to talk about the New Deal now as you want to. Right, there's always a question of sort of reform, incrementalism, revolution. There's always a question of delivering goods to members, delivering goods to constituencies, or trying to build for something greater that might require, as Maria was saying, right, not lying about sacrifices. And so I'm curious to hear. This question of the power of concentrated capital is, I think, one of the things that we've been talking about for the past few days. So I'm curious to hear what people think about these various strategies, these various strategies and tactics, and how we might negotiate and compare these. And whoever wants to take that up, go for it.
This is so. Just your question.
Oh, it's reform or revolution. It's also incrementalism. It's also, are we saving capitalism or doing something else?
Great question. Yeah, go for it. You want me? Well, so our movement ancestors in the U.S. answered this question one way, and before the New Deal, and some of the movement leaders used their leverage in Europe and in some other places to answer this question very differently. This question of whose responsibility is it to provide for the good and welfare of the people. Now, I'm not for retooling capitalism, so I'll just be transparent about that. I'm definitely for building something different. But I think that what that looks like on a day-to-day basis is different depending on where you're at and what you're building. But all that is to say that the decisions we make now and the types of campaigns we win now really matter. So, for example, instead of just trying to get, enterprise-based contract after contract after contract with all these small companies, like what's the actual sectoral play? What's the actual industry-wide play? Or what demands are we making on the state simultaneously that create leverage and also relieve pressure on regular working people? I often cringe the idea of this reform versus revolution question because, it's like, the people who are called, I remember just like one of my favorite stories of being in college, and there was this huge group that came in to our peace meeting or whatever and was like, you're going to call for a strike tomorrow, and I was like, yeah, and all six of them struck the next day, and it was like amazingly ineffective. And I just think that, and yet meanwhile, so anyway, the working people need to see their ability to win. They need to see impact in what they're doing, not just ideas, but they need the ideological framework to then draw the lines and make much bolder and more successful demands. So I think that's a really important, and why I often bring the New Deal into that is because we're still kind of living off of and struggling under, depending on where you sit, the New Deal compromises that were more about saving capital and not actually about building something different or protecting, at the very least, protecting workers for its own sake. As opposed to keeping labor peace so commerce could flow more freely. And I was actually in a room recently where a labor president, who shall remain unnamed, stood up and gave this rousing speech about this moment in the class struggle and how we need to just get things back to the way they were in the 50s. And I was like, wow, okay, I don't know if you were black in North Carolina in the 50s, but I don't think that was a really cool situation. So I do think that because of that, it really matters. And that's not to say that our brothers and sisters in Europe have done it perfectly by any scope of the imagination. But I do think that those types of decisions in this moment, as capital is reorganizing itself to be even more dastardly in the coming century to all of us and more deadly, that this is the type of moment where we have to ask this question, not just to say, no, we aren't trying to just save capital, we're trying to build something new, but also to then sit there and say that, in effect, is going to lead to revolutionary changes. Like those types of small campaigns. In order to have a revolution, you actually have to have a bunch of people in motion thinking that something needs to change. And that starts with regular, everyday campaigns that impact their lives and let them know that something can be won if they come together collectively to do something about it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And there's a thinker that has been revived recently, at least in the DSA world, Andre Gortz, who's talking about the idea of non-reformist reforms. I prefer the much more evocative transformative reforms because we cannot have collective liberation under capitalism, I believe. And the one way to think about this is doing a campaign, because you have to confront capital, otherwise people are not going to feel their own power and they're not going to see their conditions change. Recently, DSA in Austin worked with a labor coalition, a community labor coalition, and as part of our campaign for Medicare for All, they canvassed on 5,000 doors, but they talked about this visionary alternative, and they also talked about passing a paid sick leave ordinance in the city of Austin, and they won. And it was the kind of thing that illustrates why it's so important that we fight for small reforms, but that alter the relations of power. Because people, I would say, not only can't we lie to people, but a lot of people already know the risks. People have seen that when you push power, it pushes back. But what they don't have is a belief that they can actually win. So it has to be close enough that it's winnable, but also will make a difference in their lives. And they need to see the path. And then when they make it happen collectively, then they're ready for the next fight and they feel more powerful.
I would, so speaking to the sort of, I guess, tension between routes to liberation through established government institutions versus through organization. I mean, you know, I don't think anybody here disagrees that you need to do both. And you know, we spoke earlier today about the teachers' strikes in, you know, or potentially giving rise to a backlash in the state legislatures that can seemingly end the strike with you know, concession to the immediate demands of the teachers, but then are able to roll back those gains when the spotlight is off and when everyone's sort of safely back to work. And it's very hard to keep doing that and keep pressure on organs of power like that when you know that, you know, essentially the power that is, you know, in control of the legislature, you know, 99.8% of the time is, you know, they exist in order to disempower state employees or the workforce in the state in general in order to profit from its policies. So I think, you know, I guess I would just speak to the necessity of having, you know, a multiple-pronged strategy for how do you win concessions from capital, and then how do you make sure that they cannot be yanked back.
On the issue of the power of concentrated capital, which I think you brought up, Ajay, it's interesting. So Anwar Sheikh said that, you know, the real problem with capitalism isn't monopolies, it's competition, right? But interestingly, if you listen to people like Peter Thiel, right, like listen to it from the devil's mouth, Peter Thiel likes monopolies much better than he likes competition, right? So for Peter Thiel, the examples that he gives is if you run a restaurant, it's very difficult to make money by running restaurants because the margins are very tight, there's a lot of competition. So he prefers to look for investment opportunities in what he calls monopolies, right? The Google, Facebooks of the world, much more lucrative. And so he looks for ideas, secrets that will lead to monopolistic positions, which leads us to antitrust as a vital question. I couldn't agree more. The problem is there hasn't really been a willingness on the part of the government to really tackle antitrust. So that needs to change, right? And I'm particularly interested in the big platforms, right? The Googles and Facebooks, et cetera, that end up really creating their own forms of regulations, right? They almost become states. Mark Zuckerberg recently said about Facebook that, yeah, we're a collection of individuals. We're almost like our own state, and we create our own rules. Same with Amazon, right? They almost become legislators, right? And that's a real problem. So we need to think about how we change that.
I want to give you all an opportunity, if you have any questions for each other, before I throw it to the audience. You don't have to. I do this in every panel, and sometimes people do, sometimes people don't.
So on the matter of the state not enforcing the antitrust policy that we currently have, or at least that we used to, that is absolutely right. The key problem in terms of kind of what went wrong is that they adopted an ideology that says if you have a large, powerful corporation like Amazon, Google, and Facebook, then that is a technologically innovative corporation, and so to deploy antitrust policy to attempt to tame it would get in the way of the true purpose of the capitalist economy, which is to grow. And I think that that's just flagrantly false as a matter of economic reality. But in terms of kind of changing the status quo, the problem that is that and it like dates back directly to the Sherman Act, the foundational antitrust law of this country. Section 1 says basically you're not allowed to get together to restrain trade, and Section 2 says you can't monopolize trade. And we have always had an inconsistency in how we enforce those two sections, where the first is essentially an attack on the little guy, and it makes them much more. It makes it, smaller and relatively less empowered entities more liable under the law, and the second section against the big guy has had a much weaker enforcement regime, and that's given rise to the situation that we have now, where basically, not only is there no antitrust enforcement against these powerful dominant tech platforms, there is antitrust enforcement against the disempowered entities trying to negotiate and bargain with them. So we have, for example, antitrust attack on Uber drivers and ride-sharing drivers in general in Seattle, and I would be very afraid under the current law about the setup that Erica described in terms of tenants getting together to organize with landlords. Again, the antitrust law has favored the one single powerful entity where you have all control in one place, as against the negotiation and collective power of multiple entities, so if we're looking for, well, how do we alter the law to go after the platforms, and where we know that power really lies in the economy now, it's exactly to reverse that that historical imbalance.
I just want to say something I can't resist, which is that the ideas of the ruling class shape our reality, and that's why people consent to their ideas and go along with them. But how do we, yes, it matters what the law is, but how is the law chosen? I mean, all politicians respond to popular pressure. So we have to organize. It's a lack of political will because people don't have power. And the only way we're going to have power is we organize. And this is why it comes back to my original thing. We have to understand what people are willing to fight for and who they're willing to follow when power pushes back. But without all positive changes in this country came about because people organized and there were riots in the streets. So we have to organize and make that happen for the next time there is a crisis in capital.
Yeah, thanks. I was also going to respond a little bit, and which I think makes a panel good when you start kind of going back and forth, right?
That's the goal.
Right. So we're going to give all props to Ajay for making this a good panel. I do. I don't know. Anyway, I don't. I agree around this question of antitrust, and we've been moving a lot of work on Amazon, both in terms of how to organize workers there, as well as the communities in which Amazon has been growing, both for their new headquarters as well as for various distribution and sorting centers and all that stuff. And antitrust has certainly been a big issue and a big topic amongst different organizations and unions who are paying attention to Amazon. At the same time, when was the last time you knocked on someone's door and antitrust was the first issue they told you about that they cared about? Anybody? Anybody? Not even one this time. So in order to build a movement, right, not even Anya, she was trying to help me out. If we're trying to build a movement to change, to rewire, or even ultimately change the foundation of our economy and of capital, we actually have to meet people in a very different place. And one thing that I would argue here is that, and I think you actually said this earlier, Raquel, is really redefining what a functional business is. And I would argue on the flip side of that for us, redefining the role of a union. The current 20th century framework is set up in a way that incentivizes union leaders, even the best of them, to ultimately protect the interests of their small group of members, usually at another equally small company, right, that can't really compete with Amazon and ultimately then, either falls apart or whatever, deunionizes. And so all I think is that, if we're going to make antitrust an issue, it's actually something that has to be, it has to come up through the process of organizing regular, everyday working people and in their experience with capital on a daily basis, whether it's through a landlord or a building owner, which is different than the super, right, or a banker or their employer. And so just like we might want to redefine, say, a healthy business as one that is good to the environment, pays sustainable wages, provides a set of benefits or whatever, I think we also have to define what a union's role is. And this brings me to an issue that I didn't get to talk a lot about, but I wanted to just bring in, which is this issue of governing, right? There's political power, and then there's governing. And we don't do a lot of discourse on what it actually means to govern, because governing isn't just something that happens in City Hall or in, whatever, Congress, whatever the rotunda is called. But governing also happens at each company, It happens at each building, in each enterprise, and unions should actually be vying for governing power in each of those places, whether it's at General Motors after we bail them out, or at different Wall Street banks after we bail them out, right? Like there's a step towards changing and shifting the entire society that involves this demand and creating a desire and a demand amongst people who don't currently have it to want to be able to govern and control not just how much they get from a company and from working, but how a company itself operates, what it produces, what its business practices are, right? That should actually be the role and function of a union or any democratic organization that is organizing working people. That's how you get to these bigger questions of antitrust or trade or some of these other issues that people, you know, will just gloss over unless they have like a real practical experience of it.
Since we're going down the line, do you want to add anything?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question to think about governance and replacing the profit motive, right? Which is just basic finance. You look at the P&L, right? Is this profitable or not? This came up a lot. Our main problem right now is that a lot of what we see in society is entirely driven by this profitability. That's what's really crushing us. But what do you replace it with? And how do you measure these things? That's a challenge. Needs to be articulated conceptually. Yeah, I think that's the key project. It all goes back to, you know, MCM Prime, right?
That's perfect. So I want to invite people, questions. Let's start with questions. And we'll do the same thing we've been doing, which is gather a few.
Thank you. I'm interested in hearing more about the question of AI and machine learning, and that came up in the context of extraction earlier in the day. But it seems to me that there's perhaps another dimension that needs to be thought about, which is that it is also replacing workers, right? I read a statistics recently, a few days ago, that some people are estimating that 40% of undergraduate students, you know, the majors that they major in, are probably not going to exist because they're going to be replaced by machine learning and automatic processes that arise from that. So, you know, organization is great and wonderful, but that presupposes that there are workers to organize. And what if the workers, for example, Amazon workers, who, you know, gather the material in the warehouses and put them in bins and so forth, they're most likely going to be automated out of their jobs in 2 or 3 years. So what good will organizing do when there aren't, or there are very fewer workers to organize in the first place?
Let's grab a couple more.
I really surprised that I don't hear anything about idea of universal basic income, because I hear it from everywhere, and why I don't hear it here?
It's a great question.
So I would love to hear in the campaigns that y'all run and in the imaginary campaigns for antitrust, how we together as part of the campaign start to envision and articulate a good life. Like, it seems to me that part of what we lost in the New Deal and then the further capitulations in the labor movement is the right to talk about what a good life might be outside of, and imagine that together. And so I would just invite some of that.
Great question.
So it seems to me that there are two big challenges to articulating this kind of transformative vision that we were all talking about. One is the incredibly diffuse set of laws that we have in the United States, which vary by state, and also which make it very difficult to create a kind of concerted political movement. And secondly, which might be more specific to our own organizational capacity, is that whether a focus on pursuing too many different sites of resistance and transformative projects at once can diffuse a movement rather than consolidate it. And I see this happen in DSA sometimes, so curious about that.
All right, that seems like a good round of questions to start with. Who wants to take up what?
I can start with automation and
Yeah, go for it.
maybe I'll touch on UBI. So with automation, which is a real threat, I think that, and it's with relationship to Amazon workers and many others, particularly more so in manufacturing, because the drones are not actually coming as fast as Bezos would like us to think. There will still be people delivering things. But I actually think that this fear of robots, which has been very much kind of perpetuated by the mainstream kind of dominant narratives, it reminds me of like the old Luddite, smash the machines, when in fact, again, back to the basic premise of like what we do right now matters for the future. If we're just about smashing the machine, then the machines will smash us, and we'll move on, and we'll talk about, wasn't it great when we had manual labor doing this, that, and the third. But if the demands we make right now are, hey, okay, so you're going to automate, 20% of these jobs, either A, 20% of us could lose our jobs and not have any kind of protection or safety net, or the productivity that you get from that increase in automation goes to workers, either through pensions, benefits, some increase to the social safety net, some increase to the tax base. I don't know. We could decide, workers in those places could decide what it should go to, but why aren't we looking at these technological gains and then saying, okay, well, what's our claim to them? And I think Michelle Miller probably said some of this in her, I've certainly heard her talk about access and our control over data and control over the technology we create. But the question in all of this, whether it's automation or new resources or extracted resources, is what is the claim of working people over that? How do we actually have power, and how do we benefit over the new productivity? So that's something that certainly at Amazon and some other manufacturing institutions is that we're looking at, because if we can work less and make more and have a more dignified life, I mean, I don't know anyone who would turn that down that I'm working with at this time. And then I think on universal basic income, it's not that it's a bad idea, but I think that how it has been projected by and how it's been defined in this moment has been really narrow and frankly a cop-out for capital. Because if they could just, if we just have a universal basic income, they can just pay us less and continue making millions of dollars and everybody's happy, right? Like, of course, that's not how it works. I think if what we're saying is a robust social safety net that includes income when people are out of work, right? If we're saying like, and at the same time holding capital accountable in the short term and ultimately figuring out how to reshape the role of businesses and this profitability motive in the long term, then sure, yeah, universal basic income within that context is fantastic. But in its own as a policy, without that, like sans the confronting of capital, is what I would consider a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that. UBI, it's interesting, right? There's the issue of increasing inequality. That's a real problem. And UBI could help to reduce the inequality from wages. So that's a good thing. But at the same time, it's not necessarily tackling the problem of institutions, right? It's just sort of throwing money at people, but not really asking the question of what social capital looks like and education, right? Is it equally available to people? The other thing, too, is that UBI is really endorsed by a lot of libertarian Silicon Valley types. So that's interesting. So I think, when the robots take over, so here's the question, right? So Marx thought that capital would replace labor, right, as the process of capital accumulation developed, and that's the downfall, right? That the contradiction, as there's more and more capital, there's actually less and less extraction of surplus value, right? So the profit goes down. Okay, there's a real insight here, almost a premonition of this Keynesian insight of missing aggregate demand, right? Which is this idea, where does the spending come from? So in the world of robots, who is buying the products that the robots are making, right? If the robots are doing all the work, people don't have a wage to spend. And I kind of think that UBI is a bit of a way to prevent that and keep the system alive. And perhaps that's why it's sort of it's popular in Silicon Valley. I don't know.
So I want to start by the somewhat insider question about DSA. There is a debate in the organization right now, and the challenge is how do we make an impact when the resistance is so diffuse? And also, every place is different. I mean, I would turn that on its head and say every place is different, therefore it needs to be somewhat diffuse. That's why we can't have cookie-cutter approaches to fighting back. Also, as an organizer, we need to have as many doors as possible for people to come into the movement, because it will take all of us to win. And I think what I've seen as an organizer in the decade that I've been organizing is people are attracted to winning, and they're attracted to good campaigns. So when there is an exciting campaign where people feel their power, it creates, centrifugal, or maybe it's the other way around. It brings people in when there's energy and there's something really exciting where they feel like we're going to win, and it's like a magnet. It brings people in. And that's the kind of thing that we want to do, because people need to be self-motivated to do this fight. And the other thing I would say is folks learn through experience. And I want to just repeat something I said earlier, which is collective debriefs are incredibly important, because you can learn what worked and what didn't work. You can democratize that and then apply those lessons. And I guess the one caveat is we all have limited resources, particularly time, which is a very limited resource for working class and poor people. And that's why you have to have democratic process to decide, how you're going to structure the work and what work you're going to focus on, and then respect those decisions. And then on the question of how to articulate what is the good life, how to create this collective vision, in the U.S. context, I think it's talking about freedom and reclaiming that word from the right. And it's not only important to reclaim that word from the right, but it's also important for bringing new people in, because people in this country think of life in terms of positive freedoms. So without glossing over the problems in our past, I think we have to understand that we are in an American context. So we need to understand our own history. We need to talk about the unfinished fight for freedom. And that gets into the question of what does it mean to be free? It means not having to go hungry, not suffering without health care, being able to live to your full potential, and have dignity and respect and live the good life. And that is a message that resonates that's why Bernie Sanders was so successful. It's a message that resonates very widely in this country.
Yeah, so very, very interesting set of questions. I'll just go down the list, I guess. So I have a fairly idiosyncratic view of the whole issue of AI and the robot revolution or whatever, which is to say, I think that is actually mischaracterizing the threat that technology poses to the economy and to workers. I don't think the issue is that workers will be replaced by technology. I don't think, the phrase artificial intelligence implies that you have a constructed machine that is able to do the work of a human being, and that is not anywhere nearby on the horizon. I think what technology is used for in our economy and the threat that it poses is not replacing workers, but rather disciplining them and threatening them. Certainly through surveillance, I think these issues like, for example, the drones aren't coming as fast as Jeff Bezos wants them to come. Well, it's not that he's doesn't know that or forecasted the future trajectory of technology. He's talking about that because he wants to threaten his workers and keep their demands in check. And so it's not really a technological point. but rather basically that the use of technology in the economy and in the workplace is one in a whole panoply of strategies and tools that are contestable. And in the present economy, these are a very powerful tool in the hands of employers because that's how we've decided to run things. But that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. So given that, I want to sort of recast the discussion of basic income in what I consider to be a much more empirically grounded view as not kind of standing in for when wages are eventually becoming obsolete because no one's working anymore, but rather a way to uphold worker power in the workplace. I mean, I study this, the phenomenon of monopsony, which is basically wage-setting power on the part of employers and the ability to dictate wages and discriminate among employees in terms of how much they make. And in that context, when employers have monopsony power, what they do is reduce employment and increase quit rates in order to exert downward pressure on wages. And if they have less discretion over wage setting, then it is no longer economic for them to reduce employment and have downward pressure on, and increase quit rates because they lack that discretion. And that's what basic income does. So it is actually, it has the flavor, I think, in the contemporary discussion of an anti-labor or post-labor policy, post-wages. It is, in fact, a very, very pro-labor policy. In a monopsonized labor market, it increases wages, and therefore it's great. It's certainly better than the tendency in what has been the evolution of the welfare state, at least in recent decades, of basically making everything contingent on on employment, and therefore putting discretion in the hands of an employer as to who's going to get a government benefit. That enhances monopsony power. It allows employers to discriminate and to essentially auction off the benefits to who's ever willing to bid the lowest in the form of taking the lowest wage and therefore sharing that benefit with the employer. And so therefore a basic income that is unconditional, being its fundamental attribute, is a very pro-worker policy. As to, I'll speak, so actually let me go to the last question and the issue of how do you deal with diffuse laws and structures. I work mostly on issues that are basically federal, that is tax policy and antitrust. And I think that that's not an accident. We have tried to tame corporate power in many ways, and it's not to say that it never works if you operate at another level than the federal level, but when it comes to moving the locus of power, say, away from a given workplace, that is going to defeat basically any purely localized campaign to redistribute power. And so, I mean, the view that, the federal government is really the one kind of all or nothing place that matters in terms of articulating a progressive and liberationist agenda is in tension, I would say, with the very good points that both Maria and Erica have made about how you have to, in organizing, present victory, basically, because the federal government is very hard to change its policy. It is very much out of reach, even when you, elect a president, however you want to consider Obama. He obviously didn't get a lot of what he wanted because having a president doesn't necessarily mean you held all the organs of power. And, a lot of what I imagine you would have to criticize about the New Deal, rightly, is due to the fact that manipulating the powerful the sources of power within the federal government is hard, but nonetheless, I would say it is necessary. And this is also true of very much of the campaign for racial liberation in American history. Ultimately, was only ever achieved insofar as it was achieved by deploying the power of the federal government on behalf of equalization of power by race. And finally, to the question of the good life, that is definitely way out of my area of expertise. But I guess I think the move to discuss freedom is important and a good one. I think I would phrase it more pointedly in freedom from control by private power. At least when I have felt most disempowered or most aggrieved politically, it is when I feel like my own fate in life is completely at the discretion of a hostile power, that can basically do whatever the hell they want.
Which is how most of us feel all the time now, right?
I'm actually going to say just a quick thing, because this ties into so much into the panel we were doing earlier. Like the UBI question, like, is it a good, is it a bad? Well, there's like shitty ways of doing it, and there are good ways of doing it. And it's often framed as like, oh, we should have a universal basic income or a job guarantee. Well, honestly, there's shitty ways of doing a job guarantee and good ways of doing a job guarantee. In every one of these cases, when these kinds of things are being measured, automation, right? Do you want to stand in that way, or do you want that to be decreasing, decreasing the amount of time being spent working while maintaining a certain standard of living? These are the kinds of questions I think you want to be asking. I'm a both and, like UBI plus. One of the best books written on UBI was by a philosopher, actually, Philip Van Perijs in the 90s, and he argued for a universal maximum basic income. It was like the most money you could like spray around as possible. It was basically a thought experiment. I don't think this will ever actually happen in reality. But why he did this? So he's like, most people in such a situation wouldn't work. He was trying to create what some economists call a free rider problem, but theoretically in an automated world, that's not a problem. Now, is that feasible within all these other boundaries, politically feasible, all these things? I don't know. But it does bring me back to one of the key things that is like a Marx thing. He says, when the working class can dispose of its leisure time as it chooses, it is literally stealing from the boss. It is stealing from capital. And this ties into the good life, right? It's not we're not trying to buy everyone a job, right? Freedom is also freedom to do whatever. Freedom is freedom to study. Freedom is freedom to do all the activities that are ascribed as atheological, useless activities. We should be free to be useless. And that is like part of this dream. It is kind of like a crusty old Enlightenment dream, but it's not that bad.
So many of my friends, including people who work on Wall Street, complain, saying, I wish I could make half of my income and work, even if it was just like 70% of the hours. Like, everyone wants to do that. When you study economics in the beginning, it's like, oh, as a worker, you can pick how much you work and how much the leisure, right? And there's a utility function, and in reality, like, the terms are imposed to you, right? This is not a choice that you have. It's like either you don't work or you work this many hours, and it tends to be kind of crushing. So there's a real problem of why we're working so much. There's interesting piece by Keynes, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, where he predicts, right, that 100 years from now, he was writing in 1930, so we're almost there, right? 100 years from that time, we will have successfully the human race will have successfully tackled the problem of our material, the conditions of our material reproduction. We'll be able to just work a couple hours a day, right? And the rest will be leisure. And the challenge will be what to do with ourselves with the free time, right? And how to find meaning and happiness. Oh boy, was he mistaken. So,
I know Erica had another thought.
Well, I actually, the last two comments by Ajay and Raphaële really resonate, so I won't repeat them because that's, and you said it much better than I would have said it, so I appreciate it. The only thing that I'll add is in relationship to the question about the good life, which I think is actually one of the things that we've been challenging ourselves on at Jobs for Justice quite frequently, because the ultimate question, and again, the name of the panel is, what to do, and I think your original name was going to be something like Marx Now What?
Yeah. because our first panel was why Marx Now, and it was Marx Now what?
Yeah, like now what? Like to what end? And it's really critical for all of us, both academics and practitioners and economists and others, to remember the to what end. It's not just okay for me to go to my family reunion and say, I'm fighting for a socialist economy that works for all of us, and this is what it's going to look like, and I'm fighting for freedom. It's actually important for me to really understand from them what they consider or would consider a dignified life. And more than likely, it's very much what we've just been talking about, particularly as it relates to time and control over our time to do the things that we want to do. But that's actually the core value and the core motivator in all of our work. It's not the issue or even the campaign, although those are the things that ultimately make our values real in the world. But it is our values, and starting there is something that the left and our movement has been weak at. And it's not a surprise that it's not any of our strengths, not just yours, Marshall, but it's something that we're going to have to really work at, because meeting people at that level is what's going to ultimately motivate them to make some of these bigger changes in the world.
That's amazing. Are there any more burning questions out there? This will be our last round. All right, go for it, man. And then we'll have beers. Yeah, I believe beers are part of the good life.
This is a burning question. How do we explain the fact that a large part of the industrial working class voted for Trump in the last presidential election?
Let me piggyback on that question. Do any of you expect that, given the antagonism that Trump has engendered in certain places, that the election this fall will be any different than usual, or might it actually have some point of change?
Hello, thank you for everything so far. I wanted to ask in the same way as the UBI question about universal basic services, and maybe as an alternative.
All right, who wants to take these up?
I feel like I keep starting. Someone else should start.
The question about why the working class voted for Trump. I recently read a piece by Nancy Fraser where she suggests that basically the past 30 years have really been about two versions of neoliberalism, right? And that they differ chiefly on an axis of recognition and not distribution. So recognition is really the idea of who from a given social class makes it to the top. And so the idea here was that we were diversifying, right, the social hierarchy, ensuring that deserving individuals from underrepresented groups could actually attain positions that were on par with the white male salary, which was great, but not enough, right, because it neglected distributional issues, which is all these other people who were left behind, right, that didn't have the requisite diplomas or degrees. So these are all the victims of the neoliberal paradigm. And so she argues that those are the victims. The victims are the ones that voted for Trump, thinking that it would sort of fill in, well, that there was a void in representation, right, in politics, and that Trump was able to sort of seduce those people. But the good news is that she also thinks that there's a real possibility for a counter-hegemonic bloc, right, that could sort of steal those voters back. She calls it she suggests the formation of a progressive populist bloc, which is essentially an alliance between progressive populists and working class strata who voted for Trump. So I don't know, that's the full explanation, but at least it gave me some reason for hope.
Yeah, well, going back to a couple of the earlier points I made, when you look at the map of who has access to 20th century power, political and economic, and who has long not had it or recently lost it, that, in essence, actually predicted Trump's victory more than anything else to me. I mean, Trump's victory of course, we all know it was the result of a right-wing, uber-right populist movement. But just to quote another Nancy, with Nancy McLean with her Democracy in Chains, right? I mean, it was still a pretty significant disruption to capital. Capital wanted everybody else to win. Now, don't get it twisted, they're going to use Trump to all their heart's content. But the voter base was voting for a populist economic message and framework against capital, and that's why a lot of the polls showed that Bernie actually had a much better chance of beating Trump than Clinton had. And in fact, I think the real question is, why did people who voted for Bernie then vote for Trump? I think that's actually where the secret sauce is. And yeah, it's not that many of them, but there is a question of who then stayed home as well. Which is a much bigger number. I think just like the key thing to come back to on this is, again, the role of white supremacy, not just in manipulating the white working class, because of course they do have some say in the matter, right? But to the degree that in addition to othering them with people of color, immigrants, refugees who were seen as worse and taking their jobs and all this kind of stuff, the working class white person was also suffering because of under neoliberalism, and no one had an answer for that outside of maybe in part Bernie, although I have lots of problems with how Bernie addressed race. We could talk about the Bernie campaign all day over drinks. But the long and short is that I think that there is and in response to that, the progressive movement almost overcorrected. You hear like foundations doing all kinds of symposium on the white working class, and we should all go back to the white working class. And that's not, I mean, there are some people who have been doing that, right, and organizing in their home communities and working class white people. And I actually think that the key is not just to organize working class white people, and the key is also not just to treat communities of color as the vanguard. I actually think again, how we shape our campaigns really matters. And so when we are shaping our fights and our struggles and our values around the shared interests of working class people as a whole, which in itself is confronting white supremacy, because if you're in a majority white community and you aren't talking about our shared interests and our shared values with people of color, then you, my friend, are not actually confronting white supremacy. You don't go to Newark just to fight white supremacy. So anyway, I think that's actually the critical lesson for us. And in response to the 2018 elections, again, going back to my map, no. I don't think it will create a big shift. Neither will 2020. And some of those people will still vote for Trump again. It is his election to lose. But that's not the point. The point is not just figuring out each election cycle after each election cycle. The point is, how do we actually build a bigger movement for democracy, economic and political, that's able to make demands on every city hall, every state house, and nationally in a way that's very different than now, that goes beyond just the current framework for elections. And I'll let somebody else answer the question about UBS.
So every single thing you said, plus one, that was great. So I would say a couple things. Yes, we have to move the 50% that are not voting, or we're not going to win. And they're not going to come out unless something changes about who's involved in politics. I would also say that this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. Trump is part of a global phenomenon. It's a phenomenon based on the failures of the left. That means we need to be self-reflective about what we've been failing at. And what we've been failing at is actually communicating with working class people around all the ways that they self-identify and move in the world. So that's, again, why I agree with everything that Smiley just said. And finally, the right in this country and abroad, but especially in this country, has used othering of anybody who is not white as a way to undermine any sort of means-tested program by creating an identity of who the parasitic other is versus the virtuous, white, hardworking, working class person. And this trend at this point, it's functioning across racial lines. So what we need to do as the left is really fight for universal basic services, because these are the kind of demands that everyone can get behind. That's why DSA is fighting for a Medicare for all system that everyone can buy into, because we have a shared interest and we have to have a tool for talking to people about that. So, yeah. Do you want to add anything?
Yes, I guess I'll speak, to the second question first. I agree with Erica that I've now sort of lost hope that anything would change in the 2018 election. I was hoping after what I would consider to be the abject failure of neoliberalism in the 2016 election that there would be some more ideological coherence to the backlash to what followed. And I must say that I don't see that now, absent this room. This has been a fantastic conference. Congratulations, Ajay. But I think that in terms of sort of discerning the political tenor in more widely in the country, I would say that we're in a period of danger that people are very inchoate in their anger at Trump, and there's a bit of a similar dynamic as to what I saw playing out in the Bush administration, which is that this is just a terrible regime and we have to get rid of it and just get it out. And that gave rise to what I consider to be the failures of the Obama administration, in that it was viewed politically as a success the day they took office or the day they won the election, and thus, the rest of us could finally, breathe out. I think, first of all, I should say that having said that about that is speaking to some degree from my own privilege, but nonetheless, there was definitely, the economic crisis was still very much ongoing, and, if the forces of public grievance are, feel as though, well, they've already accomplished their political agenda when the key decisions are being made, what direction those decisions are going to be going in, and that's ultimately what happened under Obama. So I am concerned, and I think resigned to the view that there's not going to be a really an ideological character to the 2018 election. I must say I'm not totally resigned to the 2020 election. Maybe I should probably share your cynicism, but I hold out hope that there will be a very a concrete ideological content to the 2020 Democratic primary, whatever your views of the last time this went down, and potentially doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go down any differently next time, but I think there is at least that potential as of today. As to the question of universal basic services, I completely agree that the alternative has been tried and failed as a redistributionist agenda. I want to kind of lift up the view that though it's not just that everyone has access to these as a right, which is true. I would say that the danger in phrasing it that way is to individualize the concern, whereas the real political agenda is to elevate the public over the private. And anything that is democratically controlled, or we should want these to expand the sphere of economic necessities that are under democratic control and not under private control. I was very heartened. I read recently the sort of expose of an interior or internal postmortem on the, I guess it was 2016 charter school referendum in Massachusetts, where all these right-wing foundations were saying, oh, we were saying all of these arguments about how the charter schools were so great for students, but we were beaten when the AFT said that we should have free public education, free high-quality public education available to all. How could we possibly mount a campaign against that, like, simplistic, overly populistic political agenda, where it was like, yeah, they showed us the way in that case, and it is very hard indeed for the kind of strategies of separation and atomization to prevail in the face of centering the public sphere and the public good as ultimately what is our goal politically.
Can I make one more comment? So I just have to talk about the ideological challenge. This cycle and in the next couple of years, we in DSA believe that single payer is the fight. And if you're out talking to folks, which we're doing on doors everywhere, we have a joke that people are either not home or they're a socialist, because everybody has a healthcare story, even if they have coverage. It's terrible coverage. So the challenge really is in the primaries, how do we bring up this fight? How do we continue the fight after the primaries into the general? How do we continue it after November? And it requires having a universal demand that allows you to talk to people. And it's, if we're not, this is I wouldn't even say that when we're on doors, people are excited about this. I would say that people are spontaneously, I mean, it's in the newspaper, people are bringing it up on their own. You talk to nurses and they're pissed and they're hearing it from patients. So it's in the air right now. So this is the fight to have.
And I think that's going to bring us very close to a close. I'm going to turn it over to Georg Blockman from the Goethe-Institute in just 1 second. But before I do, just want to thank everyone for attending, everyone who spoke, everyone on this panel, all of you for listening, people at home for watching. We opened this conference with people reciting lines and what they thought they might mean today. And in reaction to this panel, I couldn't help myself. It's the second most famous line Marx ever wrote, right? The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And so on behalf of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and all my colleagues, I thank you. And I thank the Goethe-Institute, and I hand it right back over to Georg.
So we didn't talk about the fact that I wanted to say some last few words before you. That's why Ajay took the words right out of my mouth, in a way, because if there is somebody who has to say thank you, it's me on behalf of the Goethe-Institute, and that I'm really glad that we initiated this symposium, these 2 days here, which for me personally were extremely inspiring. This weekend, we were not the only ones discussing about Karl Marx. I know that there are a lot of discussions like that going on in Germany, and some of them are online, like our discussions. What I profited most from, I'm a little bit of an alien. I'm a German, a European coming here. I profited most from the fact that I learned a lot about the American discourse here. And that is what we, even as or especially as a Goethe-Institute, can profit from, that we encourage this discourse which took place here, because the German discourse is done in Germany and we can all join it through the internet. So we have to have this platform here. So thank you so much to the audience, to all these exciting panelists, and in particular to our friends from the Brooklyn Institute of Social Research, who managed and organized all that. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon for other events here, targeting for a better world. Thank you. Now the bar is open again.
The bar is open.